My name is Amber, and I am 34 years old when my husband David, a retired Army colonel, passed away unexpectedly. My mother-in-law did not waste even a single tear. Instead, she cornered me at his funeral and demanded the house, the family business, and every single thing he left behind. My attorney begged me to fight her. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but I just looked at him and said, "Let her have it all." The entire courtroom thought I had completely lost my mind when I signed away a multi-million-dollar estate with a smile on my face. My mother-in-law was practically glowing, convinced she had finally put the little gold digger in her place. But her victory lap ended abruptly when the judge closed the heavy file folder, looked directly at her attorney, and asked one simple, devastating question. Before I tell you exactly how I legally destroyed the woman who made my life miserable, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they were untouchable. It had only been 2 hours since we laid David to rest. He was 52 years old, a man of incredible honor and discipline. After retiring from the Army, he built a highly successful defense logistics company from the ground up. We shared a beautiful, sprawling estate in Virginia, a place we had filled with light and love during our 5 years of marriage. His sudden heart attack shattered my world into a million unrecognizable pieces. I was still numb, moving through the motions of the wake, being held in our grand foyer. The house was filled with grieving military officers in their dress uniforms and somber business partners paying their final respects. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the low murmur of shared sorrow. I was standing near a large oak table, blindly staring at a framed photograph of David in his uniform when the crowd suddenly parted. My mother-in-law, Beverly, marched toward me. She wore an expensive black designer dress and a wide-brimmed hat that made her look like she was attending a dark-themed gala rather than her eldest son's funeral. Trailing right behind her was Jason, David's 38-year-old brother. Jason was the undisputed golden child of the family, a man who had never held down a real job but lived a life of luxury funded entirely by David's hard work and Beverly's relentless enabling. There was no warmth in Beverly's eyes as she stopped in front of me. She did not offer a hug or a word of comfort to the woman who had just buried her husband. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick legal envelope, and thrust it directly into my chest. I caught it reflexively, looking down at the heavy paper. "I am giving you official notice," Beverly announced. Her voice was not hushed for the solemn occasion. In fact, she spoke loudly, making sure that the generals, colonels, and corporate executives gathered around us could hear every single word. "You have 48 hours to pack up your cheap little clothes and vacate my family's estate. This is a formal cease and desist letter drafted by my attorneys. You are no longer welcome on this property or at the company headquarters." The murmurs in the room died down instantly. The clinking of coffee cups stopped. Several military officers turned their heads, their expressions hardening as they witnessed this blatant disrespect. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and even. I looked from the envelope up to Beverly's smug face. "Beverly, we just buried David 2 hours ago," I said, keeping my voice quiet and controlled. "This is our home. It is his wake. Can you not show even a shred of decency for one afternoon?" "Decency is for people who actually belong in this family," Beverly snapped back, stepping closer to invade my personal space. "We all know the truth about you, Amber. You are nothing but a little calculator puncher who saw an older, successful military man and sunk your claws into him. You married my son for his pension, his defense contracts, and this magnificent house. But the free ride is over. It is time for the adults to reclaim the family legacy." I was a forensic accountant, a professional who spent her days analyzing complex financial webs, tracing hidden assets, and exposing corporate fraud. David had always respected my intellect and my career. But to Beverly, I was just a blue-collar nuisance who had somehow tricked her wealthy son into marriage. She had spent the last 5 years making sure I knew I was beneath her. At every Thanksgiving dinner, she would point out how my modest upbringing made me unfit to host her high society friends. During family vacations, she would loudly wonder why David did not marry someone from a respectable political family. I had endured her toxic behavior in silence out of respect for my husband, knowing how much it pained him to be caught in the middle. But David was gone now, and Beverly was wasting no time staking her claim. Jason stepped out from behind his mother, a wide, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, jingling them loudly in the quiet room. I recognized the keychain immediately. It was the leather fob belonging to David's custom corporate SUV. Jason had apparently gone into our private garage and helped himself to the vehicle while I was at the cemetery saying my final goodbyes to my husband. "Looks like I am the man of the house now," Jason said, tossing the keys in the air and catching them. "Do not worry about taking the corporate car, Amber. I already transferred my stuff into it. You can call a cab to haul your boxes to whatever cheap apartment you end up in. Mom is right. The golden era of the family is back, and we are taking control of the company starting Monday morning." I looked at the keys in Jason's hand, then at the cruel satisfaction burning in Beverly's eyes. They were completely blinded by greed, so desperate to seize the wealth they felt entitled to that they did not even care who was watching. They expected me to break down. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg for a few more days in the house, or to cause a massive scene that would validate their narrative that I was just an unstable gold-digging widow. Instead, I let a profound, icy calm wash over me. My mind shifted from the grieving wife to the forensic accountant. I knew things about this family, about that defense logistics company, and about Jason's activities that they could not even begin to fathom. They thought they were staging a hostile takeover. They had no idea they were breaking into a sinking ship. I looked down at the cease and desist letter in my hands. I did not open it. I simply folded it in half. The silence in the foyer was deafening, as dozens of pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for my reaction. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my own keyring. With slow, deliberate movements, I worked the heavy brass house key off the metal loop. I stepped toward Beverly, closing the distance between us. Her smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second as she saw the complete lack of fear in my eyes. I held out my hand, and when she reflexively opened hers, I dropped the house key directly into her palm. The cool metal clinked against her expensive rings. "You want the house, the company, and the legacy," I whispered, my voice so soft that only she and Jason could hear it. "Then you can have it all, but be very careful what you ask for, Beverly, because once you take it, you can never give it back." Beverly's eyes narrowed, clearly confused by my lack of resistance, but her greed quickly overrode her suspicion. She clutched the key tightly, her smile returning with full force. She turned to the crowd of guests, puffing out her chest. "You see, everyone," Beverly announced loudly, playing the role of the triumphant matriarch. "The trash is taking itself out. Please enjoy the rest of the catering. Jason and I have a lot of estate planning to get started on." She turned on her heel and marched down the hallway toward David's private home office, with Jason trailing right behind her like an obedient puppy, still jingling the stolen car keys. They were positively gloating, convinced they had just executed the perfect ambush and forced me out of their wealthy kingdom. I stood in the foyer, watching them disappear behind the heavy oak doors of the office. A few of David's military friends stepped forward, offering to call their own lawyers for me, their faces etched with anger at how I had just been treated. I thanked them gently, assuring them I would be fine. I gathered my coat and walked out the front door of the estate I had called home for 5 years. As I walked down the long paved driveway toward my own modest sedan, the cold Virginia air cleared my head. Beverly and Jason thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied a grieving widow into surrendering a $12 million empire. What they did not know was that just weeks before David's sudden death, we had spent long nights sitting at our kitchen table, auditing the company's internal servers. They had no idea what we had found buried in the ledgers, and they had absolutely no idea what David had done to protect me from the fallout. As I started my car engine, I looked back at the grand house one last time. I remembered David holding my hand late at night as we traced the missing funds. He was so devastated that his own flesh and blood would betray him. He had spent his entire military career protecting our country, only to come home and find the real enemies sitting at his dinner table. Beverly had always underestimated me, assuming a forensic accountant was just a glorified bookkeeper. She never realized that tracing hidden liabilities was my specialty. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the estate, leaving them to their stolen victory. My immediate surrender was not an act of weakness or defeat. It was the crucial first step in a lethal, perfectly calculated trap, and Beverly had just gleefully locked herself inside it. The cold light of a dreary Tuesday morning crept through the thin blinds of my temporary apartment. It was a sterile, fully furnished short-term rental on the outskirts of Alexandria, a stark and jarring contrast to the sprawling Virginia estate I had called home just 24 hours ago. The smell of cheap burnt coffee filled the small kitchen, replacing the rich aroma of the custom blends David used to brew for us every morning. My chest ached with a hollow, physical pain that only comes from fresh grief. I had just buried the love of my life, a retired Army colonel who treated everyone with honor and respect, only to be thrown out onto the street by his own mother and brother. Yet as I sat down at the flimsy particle board desk in the corner of the living room, I did not allow myself to cry. Tears were a luxury I could not afford right now. David had left me with a mission, and I intended to execute it with the exact military precision he had taught me. I opened my laptop and connected to the secure virtual private network we used for David's defense logistics company. As a forensic accountant, I had spent the last 3 years managing the complex financial architecture of his business. We handled highly sensitive supply chain contracts for the Department of Defense, a job that required absolute transparency and rigorous audits. I typed in my credentials, needing to verify that the final routing numbers for the financial trap David and I had set were still securely in place. I hit enter. The screen flashed a bright, unforgiving red. Access denied. I frowned and tried my secondary administrative login, a backdoor channel David had specifically created for me to monitor the offshore accounts we had been investigating. Again, the screen flashed red. Account suspended. Please contact your system administrator. Before I could even process the lockout, my cell phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from Jason, my 38-year-old brother-in-law. Jason was the family parasite, a man who had coasted through life on his mother's endless coddling and David's reluctant generosity. He held a purely ceremonial title of vice president at the logistics firm, a role that required him to do absolutely nothing other than collect a massive paycheck to fund his gambling habits. I opened the message. It was a photograph. Jason was sitting in David's private corporate office. He had his expensive Italian leather shoes propped up on David's antique mahogany desk. He was leaning back in David's custom chair, holding a glass of scotch, flashing a wide, arrogant smirk at the camera. Below the photo was a brief, taunting caption. Lockout complete. The golden era is back. Do not bother trying to log in again, little accountant. A surge of disgust washed over me. Less than a day had passed since we lowered his brother into the ground, and Jason was already desecrating his office, celebrating like he had just won the lottery. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me. He thought that by revoking my network access, he had severed my only tie to the company and successfully staged his hostile takeover. But Jason's predictable arrogance was just the beginning of the assault. My phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden desk. It was not just one message, it was a relentless, overwhelming barrage of notifications. I opened my messaging application and found myself staring at dozens of texts from David's extended family. Beverly had not just kicked me out of the house, she had spent the entire night launching a coordinated, vicious smear campaign to completely destroy my reputation. My aunt-in-law, Linda, sent a massive paragraph calling me a shameless gold digger. She accused me of trying to steal David's life work before his body was even cold. My cousin Brian, who had always been blindly loyal to Beverly, texted me demanding that I return the diamond earrings David had bought me for our anniversary, claiming they were family heirlooms that I had no right to keep. Uncle Thomas sent a scathing message threatening to call the police if I ever tried to contact them again. As I read through the vitriol, the scope of Beverly's manipulation became crystal clear. She had spun a masterful, completely fabricated narrative. According to the furious texts from my relatives, Beverly was claiming that she had caught me in the middle of the night trying to drain the corporate bank accounts and wire millions of dollars to an offshore destination. She told everyone that she and Jason had heroically intervened just in time, stripping my access to save the family business from a greedy, calculating widow who was planning to flee the country. She positioned herself as the grief-stricken, protective matriarch and painted me as a common criminal. The extended family, obsessed with preserving their wealthy social circle and terrified of Beverly's wrath, swallowed the lie without a single question. People who had smiled at me at Thanksgiving, people who had accepted generous loans from David people I had hosted in my home, they all turned on me instantly. Not a single person asked for my side of the story. Not a single person asked how I was coping with the loss of my husband. They simply lined up to participate in my execution, eager to prove their loyalty to the woman who controlled the family purse strings. I sat back in my chair, staring at the incoming messages. The isolation was profound and suffocating. Beverly wanted me to feel entirely alone. She wanted me to panic, to defend myself, to send long, desperate paragraphs begging for them to believe me. She wanted me to fight a public battle I could never win, draining my energy and distracting me from the company. I reached out and placed my phone face down on the desk, silencing the constant buzzing. I did not type a single reply. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Let them believe the lies. Let Beverly bask in her manufactured glory. Every hour she spent celebrating her false victory was an hour she was not looking closely at the company ledgers. I stood up from the desk and walked into the small, cramped bedroom of the rental apartment. In the corner sat my single piece of luggage. It was the only thing I had taken with me when I walked out of the Virginia estate. Beverly and Jason had watched me roll it down the driveway, completely convinced that it contained nothing but cheap clothes and personal trinkets. I placed the heavy suitcase flat on the thin carpet and unzipped the main compartment. I pushed aside the few sweaters and jeans I had packed, exposing the hard, structured bottom of the luggage. With steady hands, I found the concealed zipper hidden along the inner seam. I pulled it back, revealing a specialized false bottom David had designed for me before his passing. Resting securely in the custom foam padding was a matte black heavy-duty external hard drive. It was a military-grade, fully encrypted device, completely untraceable and indestructible. I lifted it from the foam, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of it in my hands. I walked back into the living room and sat down at the desk. I plugged the specialized cable into my laptop port. Immediately, a stark black screen popped up, demanding a 32-character alphanumeric passphrase. I did not need to check my notes. David and I had memorized the sequence during those long, sleepless nights at our kitchen table when we first discovered the massive fraud his mother and brother were committing. I typed the passphrase flawlessly, my fingers flying across the keys with absolute certainty. I pressed enter. The screen illuminated my face with a bright, crisp light, as a progress bar appeared, quickly shooting up to 100%. Folder after folder populated my desktop. There were thousands of decrypted files. I had full unrestricted access to the complete shadow ledgers, the forged federal loan applications Beverly had signed, the offshore wire transfers Jason had authorized, and the comprehensive forensic maps David and I had built to track every single stolen dollar of Department of Defense funds. Jason thought he had locked me out of the company by changing my password on a commercial server. Beverly thought she had stripped me of my power by taking back a house key. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they failed to realize they had just fought a war over an empty fortress. I looked at the photo of Jason sitting at David's desk, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. They locked me out of the empty shell, I murmured to the quiet room. They did not realize I already took the core. The screen of my laptop glowed in the dim light of the apartment, casting sharp shadows against the bare walls. Folder after folder populated my desktop, an intricate maze of data that I knew intimately. As a forensic accountant, numbers always told me a story, and the story unfolding before my eyes was a masterpiece of greed and betrayal. I clicked on a master file labeled with a string of dates. Thousands of decrypted documents loaded instantly. I had full, unrestricted access to the complete shadow ledgers of my late husband's defense logistics company. I scrolled through the first batch of files, my eyes scanning the forged federal loan applications that Beverly had signed. Beside them were the offshore wire transfers Jason had authorized. It was a comprehensive forensic map that David and I had built together to track every single stolen dollar of Department of Defense funds. Jason thought changing a password on a commercial server would lock me out. Beverly thought taking a house key would strip my power. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they failed to realize they had just fought a war over an empty fortress. My mind drifted back to a rainy evening just 3 weeks ago, long before David's heart gave out. We had been sitting at our large kitchen island in the Virginia estate, empty coffee mugs scattered around us. David had asked me to run a routine internal audit on a few minor vendor discrepancies he had noticed. What started as a simple check unspooled into a massive, terrifying conspiracy. I remembered the exact moment my analytical software flagged the first ghost account. It was a shell company registered in a jurisdiction known for corporate secrecy, and regular payments were being funneled into it from the primary logistics operating budget. David had stood behind my chair, his large hand resting gently on my shoulder. I watched his posture stiffen as I opened the attached invoices. They were completely fabricated. Millions of dollars in defense contract funds, money meant to secure supply chains for military operations, were being siphoned away. We traced the routing numbers back to domestic accounts controlled exclusively by his mother and his brother. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Beverly and Jason had been forging David's signature for years to secure massive high-interest illegal loans against the company assets. They were bleeding the business dry to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. I uncovered transactions showing Beverly using stolen government funds to pay for her extravagant country club memberships, luxury vacations, and designer wardrobes. Jason had been wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover massive gambling debts and fund his endless stream of luxury purchases. They had weaponized David's blind trust. He had given them nominal positions in the company out of familial loyalty, believing they would respect the boundaries he set. Instead, they viewed his success as a personal piggy bank, stealing the very foundation of his life's work while smiling in his face at Sunday dinners. I will never forget the look in David's eyes that night. He was a retired Army colonel, a man who lived his entire life by a strict code of honor, duty, and loyalty. Discovering that his own flesh and blood had committed federal fraud using his name was not just a disappointment. To a man like David, it was absolute treason. He did not yell. He did not throw things. He simply walked into his study, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat in the dark for hours. When he finally emerged, the loving, indulgent son and brother was gone. In his place was a military tactician preparing for a counterstrike. David knew that confronting them directly would only result in tears, lies, and immediate destruction of evidence. More importantly, he knew that a federal audit by the Department of Defense was completely unavoidable. The government always came to collect, and the missing funds would undoubtedly trigger a massive investigation within a matter of months. Instead of trying to protect the compromised assets, David methodically built a trap. Over the course of our final 2 weeks together, he secretly restructured his entire estate. He tied the sprawling Virginia house, the fleet of luxury cars, and all the corporate entities into one single, inescapable liability package. He legally bound the physical assets directly to the fraudulent debt. He transformed the business from a profitable enterprise into a financial ticking time bomb set to detonate the moment the federal agents came knocking. He essentially placed a crown on a guillotine. He knew Beverly and Jason coveted the title, the house, and the prestige more than anything in the world. He knew their greed would make them blind to the danger. He made absolutely sure that whoever claimed the company would automatically claim the federal fraud liability that came with it. It was the ultimate poison pill, crafted with surgical precision. A sharp ping from my laptop brought me back to the present moment. An email notification popped up in the corner of my screen. The sender address belonged to a senior partner at the highly expensive, aggressive law firm Beverly had hired to handle the estate transition. I opened the email. The tone was exactly what I expected from an attorney representing my mother-in-law. It was incredibly arrogant, dripping with condescension and legal threats. The message officially demanded that I surrender all claims to the estate, the corporate holdings, and the physical properties at an upcoming expedited probate hearing. It stated that if I attempted to fight for my spousal share, they would drag my name through a lengthy, humiliating public trial and seek damages for alleged corporate interference. Beverly wanted a clean sweep. She wanted me to sign a legally binding waiver of inheritance in front of a judge so that I could never return to claim a single penny. She wanted to humiliate me to prove that she was the absolute victor in this manufactured war. I read the email twice, making sure I understood the exact legal mechanisms they were proposing. They were offering to take full ownership of the consolidated trust David had built. They were literally demanding the keys to the trap. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number for Mr. Caldwell, my personal attorney. He was an older, highly experienced estate lawyer who had worked with David for years. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with concern. "I just received the email from Beverly's legal team," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I assume you were copied on the correspondence." "I saw it, Amber," Mr. Caldwell replied, a heavy sigh filtering through the receiver. "It is a completely aggressive intimidation tactic. They are trying to scare you into walking away from a multi-million-dollar estate. As your legal spouse, you are entitled to at least half of everything David built. We need to file an immediate injunction to stop Jason from operating the business and demand a full inventory of the assets. I have the paperwork ready to go. We can fight this and win." I stared at the decrypted files on my screen. I looked at the forged signatures, the illegal offshore wires, and the crushing federal debt that was hiding just beneath the surface of the corporate facade. "We are not fighting this, Mr. Caldwell," I said. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Amber, you cannot be serious," he finally stammered. "If you do not contest this demand, they will take everything. You will be left with absolutely nothing from the business or the estate. You cannot just let them bully you out of your rightful inheritance. It will make you look guilty, like you are running away, just like Beverly is telling everyone." "I appreciate your concern," I replied, picking up a pen and casually twirling it between my fingers. "But I am paying you to execute my instructions, not to debate my strategy. I want you to reply to their legal team immediately." "What exactly do you want me to say to them?" Mr. Caldwell asked, his voice thick with frustration and disbelief. I looked at the photograph Jason had sent me earlier, the one of him sitting arrogantly in David's chair, completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs aimed directly at his head. "Tell them I accept their terms unconditionally," I ordered. "Tell them I will sign the total surrender of assets at the probate hearing. Give them exactly what they are demanding." "But Amber," Mr. Caldwell pleaded one last time, "why would you hand them the entire kingdom without a single fight?" "Because, Mr. Caldwell," I murmured, a cold sense of justice settling over me. "The kingdom is built on a landmine, and they just demanded the detonator. Tell them I surrender." The neon sign of an old diner flickered outside the rain-streaked window, casting a harsh red glow across the cracked vinyl booth where I sat. I traced the rim of a ceramic coffee mug, waiting. Mr. Caldwell walked through the glass doors exactly 20 minutes after I had ended our phone call. He looked entirely out of place in his tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair slightly damp from the cold Virginia drizzle. He did not bother scanning the room. He marched straight to my booth and slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto the sticky laminate table. The loud smack caused a nearby waitress to jump, but my attorney ignored her. He slid into the seat across from me, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a volatile mixture of anger and genuine fatherly concern. "Amber, I am going to pretend that phone call was a symptom of acute grief," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice a harsh, raspy whisper. "I am going to pretend you did not just order me to hand over a $12 million estate to a pair of absolute vultures." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I am perfectly lucid, Mr. Caldwell. I meant every word I said on that phone. I want you to draft the surrender documents immediately." He unlatched his briefcase with a violent snap, pulling out a thick stack of financial summaries and estate planning drafts. He spread them across the table, covering the menus and the sugar dispenser. Do you even comprehend what you are walking away from? He demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the bottom line of a balance sheet. David spent his entire post-military career building this defense logistics firm. The commercial real estate alone is worth millions. The government contracts guarantee a massive stream of revenue for the next decade. As his legal spouse, you are statutorily entitled to at least half of this entire empire. Virginia law protects you. Beverly cannot simply kick you out and seize the corporate assets with a threatening letter. We have the legal high ground. I know what the law says, I replied calmly. Then why are you rolling over? He pleaded, his anger softening into desperation. I have known David for 15 years. I helped him incorporate that business when he first retired from the army. I know how much he loved you. He would be absolutely sick to his stomach watching his mother and brother bully you into poverty. If you sign this unconditional surrender, you are giving them permission to erase you from his legacy. He leaned across the table, lowering his voice further. And we have to talk about the optics, Amber. Beverly has spent the last 24 hours calling every single person in David's social circle. She is telling anyone who will listen that you tried to empty the corporate accounts in the middle of the night. She is telling military generals and defense contractors that you are a thief. If you refuse to fight, if you just pack up and walk away without demanding your spousal share, you validate every single vicious rumor she has spread. People will think you surrendered because you got caught. They will think you are guilty. I looked into Mr. Caldwell's eyes. I saw the fierce loyalty he held for my late husband. It took every ounce of my willpower not to pull out my laptop and show him the decrypted shadow ledgers. I wanted to show him the forged loan applications. I wanted to explain how Beverly and Jason had been siphoning Department of Defense funds to pay for luxury cars and country club memberships. I wanted to tell him that the $12 million estate he was pointing at was actually a $14 million federal fraud trap waiting to explode. But I could not tell him a single thing. Mr. Caldwell was a bound officer of the court. He operated under strict ethical guidelines and legal obligations. If I explicitly informed him that the corporate entity and the physical estate were riddled with federal embezzlement liabilities, he would be legally prohibited from facilitating the transfer of those assets to Beverly. He would be forced to halt the probate process, report the discrepancies, and freeze the estate. That would destroy the meticulously designed trap David had built during his final days. I had to keep my attorney completely in the dark to protect his law license and to ensure Beverly swallowed the bait without any judicial interference. I appreciate your dedication, Mr. Caldwell, I said, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. But I am paying you to execute my legal instructions, not to manage my public relations. Beverly can tell her country club friends whatever she wants. I do not care about the optics, and I do not care about fighting a public war over David's money. He stared at me, completely baffled by my icy detachment. You are handing them a fortune, Amber. You are giving them the entire kingdom on a silver platter. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us so my voice would not carry across the quiet diner. I am not surrendering, Mr. Caldwell. I am handing them the grenade they are begging for. Now I need you to go back to your office. I want you to draft the paperwork exactly as Beverly's legal team requested. I want a total unconditional waiver of my inheritance. I want it ironclad, so that when she signs the documents to assume sole ownership of the estate and the corporate entities, there are absolutely no loopholes. Give them exactly what they asked for. Mr. Caldwell stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He searched my face, looking for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finding none, he slowly gathered the financial summaries and placed them back into his leather briefcase. He snapped the latches closed, the sound sharp and final. I will draft the paperwork, he said, his tone shifting from protective to purely professional. I will submit the unconditional surrender to the probate judge, but I want it on the record that I strongly advised against this course of action. Your objection is noted and appreciated, I replied. He stood up, gave me a curt nod, and walked out of the diner into the pouring rain. I watched his car pull away from the curb. The hardest part of this plan was letting the people who cared about David believe I was a coward. But it was a necessary sacrifice. Justice required absolute discipline. I paid for my coffee, pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders, and drove back to my temporary apartment. The rain had stopped by the time I walked through the door, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy gray. I sat down at my particle board desk and opened my personal laptop. I did not log into the encrypted hard drive this time. Instead, I opened my standard web browser and logged into my social media accounts. I navigated to Jason's public profile. Jason had never been one for discretion. He treated his social media like a continuous broadcast of his manufactured wealth and superiority. Sure enough, a bright red ring around his profile picture indicated he was currently broadcasting a live video. I clicked on the video, making sure my microphone was muted. The feed opened to show the massive interior of the Defense Logistics Company warehouse. Towering steel racks filled with military-grade supply crates stretched far into the background. Jason was standing in the center of the loading bay, wearing a custom-tailored suit that he had undoubtedly purchased using a stolen corporate credit card. He was holding a bottle of expensive champagne in one hand and his phone in the other, broadcasting to hundreds of his followers. "What is up, everyone?" Jason shouted into the camera, his face flushed with the thrill of unearned power. "As you all know, there have been some major changes in the family business recently. We had to clean house and get rid of some dead weight that was holding this company back." He took a large swig directly from the champagne bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his expensive sleeve. "My brother built a great foundation." Jason continued, shaking his head with mock pity. "But David was too conservative. He played it too safe. And his little accountant wife was even worse. They did not understand how to really leverage capital. But the golden era is officially back, baby." As the new acting CEO of this logistics empire, I am proud to announce a massive new expansion. We just secured a brand new multi-million-dollar line of corporate credit against the commercial real estate. We are upgrading the entire vehicle fleet and we are expanding our offshore vendor networks. We are taking this business to the absolute moon. I watched the screen, my analytical mind instantly calculating the damage. By taking out a massive new line of credit against the commercial property, Jason had just unknowingly deepened the fraud. He was using compromised federal contracts to secure private loans. He was publicly admitting to expanding the very offshore vendor networks that the Department of Defense was already investigating for embezzlement. He was actively tightening the noose around his own neck and broadcasting his crimes in high definition. Beverly stepped into the frame, wrapping her arm around Jason's shoulder. She looked immaculate, wearing a bright, celebratory smile. To the future, she cheered, raising her own glass to the camera. To taking back what rightfully belongs to our bloodline. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing. I was not looking at Beverly or Jason anymore. I was looking past them, deep into the background of the live video feed. Through the massive open doors of the warehouse loading bay, out in the sprawling concrete parking lot, a convoy of vehicles was quietly rolling through the main security gates. They were not corporate delivery trucks. They were 4 identical, unmarked black sedans. The vehicles parked in a neat diagonal line, effectively blocking the main exit of the logistics facility. As Jason continued to brag to the camera about his financial genius, the doors of the black sedans opened simultaneously. Several men and women stepped out into the damp parking lot. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow lettering across the back. They were carrying heavy metal clipboards and thick black briefcases. They were the federal auditors from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Jason was too busy reading the comments on his live feed to notice the agents walking purposefully toward the loading bay ramp. Beverly was too busy fixing her hair in the reflection of her phone screen to see the federal badges flashing in the distance. I watched the federal agents step into the warehouse, their silhouettes moving steadily behind Jason's arrogant, laughing face. The audit had officially arrived. The government had come to collect the stolen funds, and Jason had just publicly declared himself the undisputed CEO of the crime scene. I reached out and closed my laptop, the screen going black. "Sign the papers, Beverly," I whispered to the empty room, a profound sense of calm washing over me. "Sign the papers and take the crown." 2 days later, the wrought iron gates of the Virginia estate opened for me one last time. I parked my modest sedan at the very end of the long, sweeping driveway. It was now deliberately crowded with expensive European sports cars and luxury SUVs. Beverly had not just scheduled a simple administrative meeting to catalog the estate assets. She had orchestrated a grand theatrical spectacle meant to cement her new status. I walked up the stone steps wearing a plain gray cashmere sweater and dark slacks. I carried a simple leather portfolio containing the documents she so desperately craved. The contrast between my modest appearance and the extravagant display radiating from the house was exactly what I wanted them to see. I needed them to believe I was thoroughly defeated. The heavy mahogany front doors were wide open. A catered waitstaff circulated through the grand foyer, carrying silver trays of mimosas and miniature appetizers. Beverly had invited at least 36 of her wealthiest country club associates to the estate. The women wore sharp daytime dresses and clutched designer handbags. The men stood around in tailored golf attire holding expensive drinks. The moment I crossed the threshold, the lively celebratory chatter in the room dropped to a hushed, judgmental murmur. I could feel their eyes raking over my simple clothes. I heard the sharp, intentional whispers echoing off the marble floors. A woman with tight blonde curls leaned into her friend. She stated loudly enough for me to hear that the little accountant was finally being sent back to the middle class where she belonged. Another guest scoffed and whispered that it was a massive blessing David's fortune was being rescued from a scheming gold digger. I kept my chin high and my breathing steady. I did not let a single ounce of anger or hurt show on my face. Every insult they hurled at me only confirmed how perfectly the trap was working. I walked directly into the formal dining room. Beverly had commandeered it as her command center. Beverly sat at the head of the massive dining table. She was flanked by 2 junior lawyers she had hired specifically to intimidate me. She wore a pristine white suit. She looked less like a grieving mother and more like a corporate raider who had just conquered a rival nation. She smiled when she saw me. It was a predatory, victorious stretching of her lips. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of taking back the house she always felt she deserved. Before Beverly could even speak, Jason swaggered into the room. My breath caught in my throat for just a fraction of a second. It was not out of sorrow. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. Jason was wearing one of David's custom-tailored charcoal suits. David had broad shoulders from years of dedicated military service. He had a solid, disciplined frame built on honor and hard work. Jason was softer and slightly sloped. The expensive fabric bunched awkwardly around his waist and hung too long over his wrists. He looked like an arrogant child playing dress-up in his deceased brother's closet. Jason poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal pitcher on the table. He leaned heavily against the doorframe. He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. He was actively playing to the audience of wealthy guests gathered near the entryway. They watched him with approving nods, eager to see the golden child assert his dominance. "It is good of you to show up, Amber," he sneered. He took a loud sip from his glass. "We wanted to make sure we got the inventory exactly right before we changed the security codes and the locks permanently. True wealth stays in the bloodline after all. You had a nice run pretending to be part of our world. But it is time to clock out and go back to your little spreadsheets." My brother was far too generous with his charity. He never should have let you touch the business. I looked at the sleeves of David's suit hanging over Jason's wrists. I thought about the federal auditors I had watched storm his warehouse loading bay on the live video stream just 2 days ago. I knew that right now those same auditors were freezing shipping manifests and pulling server hard drives. The federal dragnet was already tightening around his neck. They were analyzing the very corporate credit lines he had been bragging about to his followers. He was wearing a dead man's suit while standing directly on a massive financial landmine. He was entirely oblivious to his impending destruction. I kept my face blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I stepped up to the long dining table and unzipped my leather portfolio. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my career or my marriage. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents Mr. Caldwell had drafted exactly to their strict specifications. I placed the heavy deed to the primary estate on the polished wood. Next to it, I placed the titles to the 3 luxury corporate vehicles that Jason loved so much. Finally, I set down the thick stack of corporate holding transfers. These papers relinquished all my administrative and spousal claims to the Defense Logistics Company. Beverly leaned forward. Her eyes gleamed with raw, unfiltered greed as she dragged the documents toward her manicured hands. She gestured sharply to her junior lawyers. They quickly began verifying the paperwork and checking for my signature on the designated lines. They scrutinized every page, desperate to find a mistake they could use to humiliate me further. "Is that everything?" Beverly asked. Her tone dripped with mock pity and supreme arrogance. "I would hate to think you accidentally packed away any valuable family heirlooms in that cheap little sedan of yours. We have a complete itemized inventory of David's watch collection and the safe contents. Do not test me, Amber. We will press charges if a single silver spoon is missing." I reached into my pocket and placed the remaining sets of physical keys on top of the paperwork. "Everything is there," I said. I kept my voice soft and deliberately defeated. "The properties, the corporate shares, the vehicles, and the bank access codes are all yours. I have signed my portions exactly where your legal team indicated. I am offering absolutely no resistance, Beverly. The estate is yours to control entirely." The country club friends who had gathered around the dining room doorway began to whisper again. Their tones were filled with smug satisfaction. They were thoroughly enjoying my surrender. They loved watching the outsider be put in her place by the rightful matriarch of the family. Beverly soaked up their admiration. She sat taller in her chair, radiating manufactured power. She believed my quick submission was absolute proof of my guilt. She thought I was terrified of being exposed as the thief she claimed I was. She thought I was running away before she could uncover my supposed crimes. I zipped up my empty portfolio and took a slow step back from the table. "If we are finished here, I would like to leave," I said. I maintained my posture of total submission perfectly. I knew that every ounce of pride I swallowed right now would compound the devastation of their eventual downfall. I turned my back on the dining table and began to walk toward the grand foyer. I navigated through the sea of wealthy guests who parted from me like I carried a contagious disease. No one offered a word of sympathy. No one acknowledged that I had just buried my husband less than a week ago. They were too busy drinking champagne and celebrating my exit. I was 5 steps away from the heavy mahogany front doors. The crisp outdoor air was calling to me. It promised an end to this suffocating theater. "Wait right there, Amber." Beverly's voice cracked through the foyer like a whip. It instantly silenced the chatter of her guests. I stopped walking and slowly turned around. Beverly had risen from the dining table and was marching toward me. She was holding the thick stack of surrender documents tightly in her hand. Jason followed closely behind her. He crossed his arms over his chest to look intimidating. He wanted to ensure I felt the full weight of their combined authority. Beverly stopped just a few feet away from me. Her smile was predatory and cruel. It was the smile of a woman who thought she held all the cards. She wanted to savor this moment to drag it out for her audience. "My lawyers have reviewed these transfers," she said loudly. She wanted to ensure every single person in the grand foyer could hear her declaration. "The paperwork is acceptable, but I am not going to let you just quietly mail this into a clerk and scurry away into the shadows. You tried to steal from this family. I want absolute, undeniable finality." She thrust the documents toward me. She shook the papers in the air for emphasis. The heavy pages rustled loudly in the quiet room. "I want you to sign the final, irrevocable waiver of inheritance in person. We are going to the county courthouse tomorrow morning. You are going to stand in front of a probate judge under oath. You are going to swear that you are walking away from my son's entire estate of your own free will. I want the court to watch you walk away with nothing. I want it on the public record so there can be absolutely no appeals, no future lawsuits, and no coming back to beg when you realize how poor you really are." The room was dead silent. The guests watched me with bated breath. They were waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for me to panic at the thought of a formal public courtroom humiliation. Beverly stared at me. Her eyes were practically burning with the anticipation of her ultimate victory. She wanted to break my spirit in front of a judge and cement her social standing forever. She needed this public execution to validate all the lies she had spread about me. I looked at the documents shaking in her hand. I thought about the $14 million in federal fraud liability attached to those very pages. I thought about the Department of Defense investigators quietly building their criminal case while Beverly obsessed over her social standing. I thought about how beautifully David's trap was functioning, drawing them in deeper with every arrogant demand they made. I let a slow, faint smile touch the corners of my mouth. I met her aggressive, greedy stare with total, unshakable calm. I would not miss it for the world, Beverly. The morning of the final probate hearing arrived with a biting chill that seemed to seep straight through the heavy stone pillars of the county courthouse. I walked up the wide concrete steps, completely alone, my low heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. My mind was exceptionally clear. While Beverly and Jason had spent the previous day throwing their lavish estate reclamation party, actively racking up tens of thousands of dollars in new corporate debt to celebrate their manufactured victory, I had been sitting in a sterile, windowless room inside a secure federal building. I had handed over the fully decrypted hard drive to two senior investigators from the Department of Defense. They had meticulously verified the forged signatures, the illegal loan applications, and the offshore accounts. Because David and I had officially reported the embezzlement before his sudden passing, the government had granted me full federal immunity. The lead investigator had looked me directly in the eye and confirmed our ultimate strategy. He told me that the moment the probate judge signed the final order, whoever held the legal title to the estate would instantly assume $14 million in federal fraud liability. I kept that devastating knowledge locked tightly behind a calm, unreadable expression as I pulled open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. I found Mr. Caldwell pacing the length of the marble hallway outside the assigned courtroom. My attorney looked physically ill. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and he clutched his leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. He had not slept. It was obvious in the dark circles under his eyes and the tense, erratic way he checked his watch. He had spent his entire career protecting David and his business interests, and now he believed he was being forced to facilitate the ultimate betrayal of his late friend. "Amber, we do not have to do this," Mr. Caldwell said the moment I approached. His voice was a harsh, desperate whisper. "I have a motion for a continuance right here in my briefcase. We can ask the judge for more time. We can force a full discovery of the corporate assets. You are handing them a multi-million-dollar empire without firing a single shot. Please let me fight for you." I placed a gentle hand on his arm. His loyalty to David was touching, and it broke my heart that I could not ease his conscience by revealing the federal trap. I knew he was ethically bound by the court, and telling him about the impending Department of Defense raid would legally require him to halt the transfer of assets. I had to let him play his part in the dark. "I appreciate your dedication, Mr. Caldwell," I said softly, "but we are moving forward exactly as planned. You have drafted the unconditional surrender just as they requested. We are going to walk into that room and finalize this." Before he could protest further, the polished silver doors of the elevator at the end of the hall slid open with a soft chime. Beverly and Jason made their grand entrance. They did not just walk down the hallway, they paraded. Beverly wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit with a silk blouse and a string of authentic pearls that radiated old money and absolute authority. She looked like a queen arriving for her coronation. Jason swaggered beside her, wearing a designer suit that was clearly brand new, likely purchased with the company credit card he had stolen. He was loudly checking the time on a solid gold watch that I immediately recognized. It was David's favorite timepiece, a retirement gift I had bought for him 3 years ago. The sight of it strapped to Jason's wrist made my blood run cold, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. They were flanked by 3 high-priced attorneys from one of the most aggressive corporate law firms in the state. These lawyers wore custom suits and carried themselves with the predatory swagger of sharks who smelled blood in the water. They took one look at me, and Mr. Caldwell exchanging arrogant, self-satisfied smiles. They genuinely believed they had successfully bullied a weak, grieving widow into submission. They thought my presence here today was nothing more than a formal surrender to their superior legal tactics. Beverly did not even acknowledge my existence as she swept past us and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Jason trailed behind her, shooting me a malicious, condescending wink before following his mother inside. Mr. Caldwell let out a defeated sigh, his shoulders sagging as he gestured for me to enter. We walked into the quiet, imposing space and took our seats at the small plaintiff table on the left side of the aisle. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, paneled in dark wood with high ceilings that seemed to swallow all sound. Across the aisle, Beverly and Jason sat at the defense table surrounded by their legal team. They were whispering and laughing softly, completely unbothered by the solemnity of the judicial environment. Beverly kept shooting sharp, triumphant glares in my direction. She wanted to see me trembling. She wanted to see tears of regret forming in my eyes. I simply folded my hands on the table and stared straight ahead at the empty bench. A heavy silence fell over the room as the side door opened and Judge Harrison entered. He was an older, deeply intimidating man, with a reputation for being a no-nonsense, meticulous jurist who possessed zero tolerance for courtroom games. Everyone rose as he took his seat at the elevated bench. He put on his reading glasses and picked up the massive, thick file folder containing the estate transfer documents and my unconditional waiver of inheritance. For several agonizing minutes, the only sound in the vast courtroom was the crisp rustling of paper as Judge Harrison turned page after page. He read through the extensive list of assets. He reviewed the valuation of the Defense Logistics Company, the deeds to the commercial real estate, the titles to the luxury vehicle fleet, and the sprawling Virginia estate. Then he read the terms of the surrender that Mr. Caldwell had drafted under my strict orders. The judge stopped reading. He closed the heavy folder and took off his reading glasses, placing them carefully on the polished wood of his desk. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bench. His expression was incredibly grave, his brow furrowed in profound confusion and concern. He looked past Beverly and her entire team of expensive lawyers. He fixed his sharp, observant gaze directly on me. "Mrs. Amber," Judge Harrison began, his deep voice carrying a weight of absolute authority that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "I have reviewed these documents very carefully. I have read the asset valuations and the terms of this transfer." He paused, his eyes searching my face for any sign of coercion or fear. "You are a 34-year-old widow," he continued, his tone turning incredulous. "According to these filings, you are the sole legal spouse and the rightful primary beneficiary of your late husband's estate. Yet the paperwork before me indicates that you are voluntarily surrendering your rightful claim to a highly lucrative defense contracting firm, multiple commercial properties, and a multi-million-dollar personal estate. You are choosing to walk away from this courtroom with absolutely nothing, handing the entirety of this immense fortune over to your mother-in-law." The tension in the room spiked instantly. I could feel Mr. Caldwell tense beside me, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Across the aisle, the smug smiles vanished from the faces of Beverly's attorneys. They sat up perfectly straight, suddenly terrified that the judge might reject the settlement out of a sense of judicial fairness. This was the exact moment Beverly had demanded. She had forced me to come to this courthouse specifically to experience this public humiliation, to have a judge confirm out loud that I was leaving with nothing. Beverly held her breath. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, gripping the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white. She was glaring at me with a ferocious, burning intensity, silently daring me to back out, daring me to complain or ask the judge for mercy. Beside her, Jason actually let out a quiet, audible snicker, amused by the idea that the judge thought I was foolish enough to throw away millions of dollars. Judge Harrison ignored them. He kept his focus entirely on me. In all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen a spouse waive their rights so completely and unconditionally, without a prolonged legal battle, the judge said, his voice echoing in the silent wood-paneled room. "Therefore, before I sign this order and make this transfer of assets irrevocable, I need to hear it from you directly under oath. Are you under any duress to sign this? Has anyone threatened you, coerced you, or forced you to surrender this estate?" The silence that followed was absolute. The air in the courtroom felt thick and heavy, charged with the electricity of a dozen held breaths. Beverly stared at the side of my face, her entire body rigid with desperate anticipation. She wanted the prize. She wanted the kingdom. She wanted the ultimate victory over the woman she despised. I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not look at Mr. Caldwell. I did not spare a single glance at Beverly or Jason. I looked the judge dead in the eye. I let the absolute certainty of my mission fill my chest, knowing that the federal trap was primed, loaded, and waiting for my final command. My voice was crystal clear, steady, and utterly void of fear as it echoed through the silent courtroom. I picked up the heavy black pen resting on the plaintiff table. The entire courtroom held its breath. The only sound in the massive wood-paneled room was the sharp, rhythmic scratching of ink against thick, legal paper. I signed my name on the first line, then the second, then the third. I moved through the stack of documents with methodical precision, completely waiving my right to my husband's multi-million-dollar estate. As my pen lifted from the final page, I slid the thick stack of paperwork across the polished table. Beverly's lead attorney lunged forward. He snatched the documents with the frantic energy of a starving man grabbing a meal. He practically sprinted to the bench, presenting the signed waivers to Judge Harrison for the final judicial seal. The judge picked up his heavy ink stamp. The loud, definitive thud echoed through the silent room. It was done. The transfer of power was absolute, legally binding, and completely irrevocable. Beverly was now the sole executor and owner of David's entire corporate and personal empire. Beverly did not even wait for the judge to formally dismiss us. She leaned far over the wooden partition separating our tables. Her face was flushed with the thrill of total victory. Her eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "You should have stayed in your place, little accountant," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Now you have absolutely nothing, and my son's legacy is back exactly where it belongs." Jason leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage that had finally been swept out of his way. I did not react. I simply folded my hands in my lap and watched the bench. Judge Harrison closed the heavy file folder. The lawyers at the defense table began zipping up their leather briefcases, quietly congratulating each other on a swift and incredibly profitable victory. But Judge Harrison did not pick up his gavel. He did not dismiss the court. He left his reading glasses on, folded his hands on top of the closed file, and stared directly at Beverly's lead attorney. "Counselor Judge Harrison," said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet shuffling of papers. "Now that your client is the sole executor and owner of this estate, is she prepared to address the Department of Justice representatives waiting in the hallway?" The lead attorney froze mid-motion. The self-satisfied smile vanished from his face instantly. He slowly lowered his briefcase back to the table. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he stammered, clearly thrown completely off balance. Judge Harrison did not repeat himself. Instead, he gave a sharp nod to the bailiff standing by the exit. The bailiff turned and pushed open the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The loud creak of the hinges drew every eye in the room. 4 federal agents stepped through the doorway. They wore immaculate dark suits with official badges clipped to their belts. They moved with terrifying synchronized purpose, their hard-soled shoes echoing against the marble floor as they marched straight down the center aisle. Each of them carried a thick black briefcase. The air in the courtroom instantly turned ice cold. Beverly stared at the approaching agents, her triumphant smile faltering as confusion clouded her features. Judge Harrison looked down from the bench, his expression devoid of any sympathy. "By aggressively seizing the entirety of this estate and assuming total control of the corporate entity, your clients have legally assumed all attached liabilities," the judge formally explained. He picked up a separate, much thinner file from his desk. "I will now read the federal indictment into the public record." Jason stopped laughing. He sat up completely straight, his face draining of color as the judge began to read the staggering figures. $14 million in defrauded Department of Defense funds. Massive multi-year corporate tax evasion. Dozens of forged federal loan applications secured against compromised government contracts. The judge listed the charges with mechanical precision. The estate Beverly had fought so viciously to claim was not a fortune. It was a massive radioactive criminal debt. By demanding I sign those papers, she had just legally chained herself and her golden child directly to it. Beverly's face turned the color of ash. The heavy string of authentic pearls around her neck suddenly looked exactly like a noose. She looked at her lead attorney, but the man had physically taken a step away from her. Corporate lawyers do not handle federal fraud indictments, and they certainly do not stand in the blast radius of the Department of Justice. He was actively abandoning his client right there in the courtroom. Complete panic set in. Beverly turned wildly toward my table. The pristine, aristocratic matriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice pitching into a hysterical scream. "She set us up." Beverly yelled, her eyes wide with terror. "She is the accountant. She manipulated the books. The debt belongs to David. We did not know anything about this. You have to arrest her." I remained perfectly still in my chair. Mr. Caldwell, who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the grenade I had just handed them, stared at me in absolute awe. He realized that I had not surrendered out of weakness. I had surrendered to ensure their destruction. The lead federal agent reached the defense table. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He unclasped his black briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of sworn affidavits, and held up the top document for Beverly to see. "Colonel David filed these extensive fraud reports against you and Jason. 3 days before his passing," the agent said, his voice cold and authoritative. "He mapped out every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every offshore wire transfer you authorized. The trap was not set by her, ma'am. It was set by him." The air in the courtroom shattered. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery as the reality of the federal agent's words settled over the room. The trap had not been set by the little accountant. It had been meticulously designed and armed by the decorated war hero they thought they had outsmarted. Beverly stared at the sworn affidavit hovering just inches from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. The heavy rings on her fingers clicked repeatedly against the wooden defense table. She looked frantically toward her lead attorney. She was silently pleading for a legal maneuver, a loud objection, or a miraculous loophole to save her. Instead of stepping forward to shield his client, the high-priced corporate lawyer took a very deliberate and rapid step back. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a resounding click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense courtroom. He looked directly up at the bench. "Your Honor," the attorney said. His voice was tight and completely devoid of his former arrogance. "My firm was retained strictly for probate and estate transition matters. We do not represent these clients in any capacity regarding federal criminal fraud or Department of Defense investigations. We respectfully request to withdraw as counsel effective immediately." Beverly let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "You cannot just leave me!" she shrieked. Her voice echoed off the high wood-paneled ceiling, losing all its refined country club polish. "I paid you an absolute fortune to handle this estate." "You paid us with compromised federal funds," the attorney replied coldly. He did not even bother to look her in the eye. He simply gestured for his 2 junior partners to follow him. The 3 lawyers walked quickly down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and abandoning their client to the mercy of the federal government. Mr. Caldwell sat beside me, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the departing lawyers to the federal agents, and then to the signed surrender documents resting on the table. The brilliant architecture of the trap was finally dawning on him. I had not given away the kingdom out of weakness. I had legally bound Beverly to a sinking ship just seconds before it went under. The lead federal agent did not miss a beat. He placed the thick stack of affidavits on the defense table, setting them right on top of the unconditional surrender documents I had just signed. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. He handed the first one to Beverly and the second one to Jason. "These are federal asset freeze warrants," the agent announced. "Effective as of this exact moment, every single bank account, property, deed, and corporate holding under your name is frozen by the Department of Justice. You no longer have access to a single penny of the logistics company revenue, your personal savings, or the estate you just assumed ownership of. The trap had snapped entirely shut, while the crushing reality of absolute financial ruin washed over Beverly in the courtroom. A highly coordinated sequence of federal actions was already unfolding across the state. The Department of Defense had been waiting for the probate judge to finalize the legal ownership of the debt. The very moment that gavel fell and the stamp hit the paper, the green light was given to task forces standing by. Miles away at the sprawling Virginia estate, the hired caterers and wealthy country club friends were still lingering in the grand foyer. They were sipping expensive champagne and gossiping about my quiet departure. Their celebratory chatter was abruptly silenced by the deafening wail of sirens. A fleet of black federal vehicles roared up the long, sweeping driveway, parking aggressively on the manicured front lawn. Armed federal marshals marched up the stone steps in tactical gear, bypassing the completely stunned guests. They pulled thick rolls of red tape from their vests and began sealing the heavy mahogany front doors. A senior marshal stood on the porch and unrolled a large printed document. He taped a federal seizure and eviction notice directly onto the polished wood of the front door. The wealthy socialites who had just been mocking my modest clothing were now scrambling frantically to escape the property. They were absolutely terrified of being implicated in a high-profile federal raid. The women who had loudly gossiped about me were now tripping over their designer heels, desperate to avoid the flash of local news cameras that were already pulling up to the estate gates. The men abandoned their expensive drinks on the antique tables, sprinting for their vehicles. They pushed past each other, rushing to their cars in a desperate, humiliating panic to flee the contaminated estate. At the exact same time, a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was backing up to the front of the house. The operator hooked heavy steel chains onto the front axle of Jason's brand-new custom-imported sports car. The vehicle he had purchased just 2 days ago using stolen company credit was hoisted unceremoniously into the air. The bright red paint gleamed in the sunlight as it was dragged away down the street destined for a federal impound lot. Across town at the Defense Logistics Warehouse, the scene was even more severe. The undercover agents I had watched infiltrating the parking lot on Jason's live video feed had completely locked down the facility. Employees were being escorted out of the building by armed guards. The agents were carrying out heavy cardboard boxes of physical files, cloning server hard drives, and padlocking the massive loading bay doors. The massive banners proclaiming the golden era that Jason had ordered were being torn down to make way for federal evidence markers. The incredible expansion Jason had drunkenly bragged about to his social media followers was now a fully secured federal crime scene. Every physical asset, every stolen dollar, and every ounce of power they thought they had successfully consolidated was being systematically dismantled and seized by the United States government. The golden era was over before it even began. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had descended into pure, unadulterated panic. Jason was staring at the federal freeze warrant in his trembling hand. He looked down at the expensive charcoal suit he had stolen from David's closet. He was suddenly realizing it was not a symbol of inherited power. It was the uniform of a condemned man. He looked across the aisle at me, sitting calmly at the plaintiff table beside an astonished Mr. Caldwell. The arrogant smirk that had defined Jason's entire privileged existence completely melted away. In its place was the raw, undeniable terror of a coward who had finally run out of places to hide. 2 more federal agents stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. They unclipped metallic handcuffs from their leather belts. The sharp metallic clinking sound cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the room. It was the sound of absolute finality. "Jason," the lead agent said. His voice echoed with cold authority. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and the ongoing embezzlement of Department of Defense funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the agent read the Miranda rights, Jason completely broke. The golden child, the man who had coasted through his entire adult life entirely on his mother's endless enabling and his older brother's hard work, shattered under the crushing weight of actual consequences. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not stand tall and accept his fate with any shred of dignity. He panicked with the intensity of a cornered animal. Jason physically backed away from the approaching agents. His hands were raised defensively in the air, as if he could physically push the federal charges away. He bumped hard into the wooden defense table, his eyes wide and wild with fear. He looked at the agents, and then he pointed a trembling finger directly at the woman standing right next to him. "It was her idea!" Jason screamed, his voice cracked with desperate, high-pitched hysteria. He shoved Beverly toward the federal agents, trying to put her between himself and the handcuffs. "Do not arrest me. She forced me to do it. She forged David's name on the loan documents, not me. She told me how to route the offshore wires. I just did what she told me to do. She is the one who stole the money. It was all her." The entire courtroom froze. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, their hands hovering over the handcuffs as they processed the immediate, unprompted public confession. I watched from my seat, not moving a single muscle, my expression perfectly neutral. Beverly slowly turned her head to look at her son. Her face was completely slack, drained of all the aristocratic arrogance she had worn just 10 minutes prior. The realization of what was happening crashed down upon her in real time. This was a pain worse than losing the estate. It was worse than the impending prison sentence. She had spent her entire life protecting Jason. She had enabled his worst impulses, funded his endless failures, and ruthlessly attacked anyone who dared to hold him accountable. She had just driven her widowed daughter-in-law out of her home specifically to secure a multi-million-dollar empire for this exact man. And the very second the consequences arrived, her precious golden child had not hesitated to throw her directly into the fire to save his own skin. Beverly stared at Jason in absolute soul-crushing horror as the ultimate betrayal unfolded right before her eyes. Beverly stared at her golden child in absolute horror as the ultimate betrayal unfolded right before her eyes. The federal agents did not hesitate. They secured the metallic cuffs around Jason's wrists. The sharp clicking sound echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. Jason continued to whimper and shift the blame entirely onto his mother as they marched him down the center aisle. He did not look back. Beverly was left standing alone at the defense table. She was completely abandoned by her expensive legal team and betrayed by the very son she had ruined her own life to protect. The lead federal agent handed her a thick packet of indictments and asset freeze warrants. He informed her that she was not to leave the state and that she would be summoned for her formal arraignment. Exactly 2 weeks passed. The glamorous socialite facade that Beverly had meticulously maintained for her entire adult life completely disintegrated. The fall from high society was absolute and brutally swift. Without access to a single penny of David's estate or the corporate accounts, Beverly had been physically escorted off the Virginia property by federal marshals. She was not permitted to pack her designer luggage or take her expensive jewelry collections. The agents allowed her to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single small bag of basic necessities. With her bank accounts completely frozen by the Department of Justice, Beverly had nowhere to go. The very same country club friends who had eagerly attended her lavish estate reclamation party just days prior suddenly treated her like a highly contagious disease. When Beverly tried to call them to ask for a temporary place to stay, her calls went straight to voicemail. When she showed up at the gates of the country club begging for entry, the security guards informed her that her membership had been suspended pending a federal investigation. The extended family members who had relentlessly harassed me with vicious text messages were now in a state of absolute blind panic. Aunt Linda, who had boldly called me a shameless gold digger, immediately blocked Beverly's phone number. She was terrified that the federal investigators would discover the generous corporate loans Beverly had illegally issued to her over the years. Cousin Brian and Uncle Thomas completely cut all ties, deleting every single message they had ever sent regarding the estate. They knew that the Department of Defense was auditing every transaction tied to the Defense Logistics Company. They were desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Beverly's greed. Beverly was forced to drain the last remaining dollars from a forgotten emergency cash stash just to secure a miserable, cramped motel room on the edge of town. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. It was a humiliating downgrade for a woman who had spent her entire life judging the working class. Jason was in an even worse state. He had spent 4 agonizing nights in a federal holding cell before a court-appointed public defender managed to secure his release on a restricted bond. Jason had no access to his luxury cars, no corporate credit cards to fund his extravagant dinners, and no tailored suits to hide his insecurities. He was forced to move into the dingy motel room with his mother. The golden child was spiraling out of control. Without his stolen money and manufactured power, Jason was nothing. He spent his days pacing the small, dirty motel room, wearing the same wrinkled sweatpants, unable to cope with the reality of his impending destruction. The tension between mother and son was highly volatile. Beverly could not forgive Jason for throwing her under the bus in the courtroom. Jason blamed Beverly for dragging him into the forged loan applications in the first place, but their bitter infighting was entirely overshadowed by the crushing weight of their legal situation. They sat across from their overworked public defender in a cramped, poorly lit government office. The attorney dropped a massive stack of federal discovery files onto his metal desk. He looked at Beverly and Jason with profound exhaustion. The public defender explained that their situation was legally indefensible. The Department of Defense investigators possessed flawless, irrefutable evidence. The government had the forged signatures, the offshore routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of every illegal transaction they had ever authorized. The attorney bluntly informed them that they were both facing decades in federal prison. The fraud charges were extensive, and the government was determined to make a highly visible example out of them for stealing military supply chain funds. Jason began to hyperventilate. He begged the public defender to negotiate a plea deal. He promised to cooperate, offering to testify against anyone the government wanted. The public defender shook his head with grim finality. He explained that the federal prosecutors did not need their cooperation. The government already possessed a perfectly clear, comprehensively mapped accounting of the entire criminal enterprise. They did not need Jason to testify because they already had a protected federal witness who had provided the complete shadow ledgers. "Who is the witness?" Beverly demanded, her voice cracking with desperate panic. The public defender pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the desk. He explained that the witness was a highly qualified forensic accountant who had been granted total, irrevocable federal immunity for coming forward and reporting the embezzlement prior to the corporate takeover. The witness had designed the forensic maps that the Department of Defense was currently using to prosecute them. Beverly and Jason stared at the name printed clearly on the federal document. It was my name. The reality of my strategy finally crashed down upon them. They realized that I had not just handed them the company to ruin them financially. I had built the exact legal framework that the federal government was now using to send them to prison. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. Jason grabbed the edge of the metal desk, his hands shaking violently. He asked the public defender if there was any possible way to reduce their sentences. He pleaded for a loophole, a legal technicality, anything that could save him from spending the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. The public defender let out a heavy sigh. He explained that there was only one highly unlikely avenue for sentence reduction. The federal prosecutors were relying heavily on the contextual accounting maps I had provided. Those maps grouped the stolen funds together under the broad umbrella of corporate fraud. However, if the forensic accountant who created those maps was willing to formally clarify the intent behind specific transactions, they might be able to separate Jason's reckless spending from Beverly's calculated forgery. If I was willing to hand over my raw, unedited working files to the defense team and testify that one party was significantly less culpable than the other, the judge might consider a reduced sentence for that specific individual. The attorney made it perfectly clear that this was an astronomical long shot. The federal witness owed them absolutely nothing. She had full immunity. She was entirely protected. She had zero legal obligation to assist the defense team in any capacity. The public defender told them that securing her cooperation would require a personal miracle. Beverly and Jason walked out of the public defender office and stood in the hot, cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The blazing afternoon sun beat down on them, offering no comfort. They were completely stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their social standing. They were staring down the barrel of a devastating federal prison sentence with no money to fight the charges and no friends to support them. They looked at each other in the harsh daylight. The bitter resentment between them momentarily dissolved, replaced by a shared, terrifying realization. They had spent years mocking my career. They had treated me like a worthless outsider who was completely beneath their elite social status. They had driven me out of my own home and cheered as I walked away with a single suitcase. They had spent the last 2 weeks spreading vicious lies about my character to anyone who would listen. Now out of options and facing years behind bars, they recognized that their entire future rested exclusively in my hands. I was the only person on Earth who held the detailed forensic accounting files that could potentially save them from maximum security prison. I held the absolute power of life and death over their freedom. Beverly swallowed hard, the realization tasting like ash in her mouth. Jason looked at the ground, his former arrogance completely hollowed out by fear. They knew exactly what they had to do. They were forced to do the one thing they swore they would never ever do. They had to find the cheap rented apartment they had so mercilessly mocked me for moving into. They had to track down the little accountant they had so proudly discarded. And they had to beg for her mercy. Beverly stared at her golden child in absolute horror as the ultimate betrayal unfolded right before her eyes. The federal agents did not hesitate. They secured the metallic cuffs around Jason's wrists. The sharp clicking sound echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. Jason continued to whimper and shift the blame entirely onto his mother as they marched him down the center aisle. He did not look back. Beverly was left standing alone at the defense table. She was completely abandoned by her expensive legal team and betrayed by the very son she had ruined her own life to protect. The lead federal agent handed her a thick packet of indictments and asset freeze warrants. He informed her that she was not to leave the state and that she would be summoned for her formal arraignment. Exactly 2 weeks passed. The glamorous socialite facade that Beverly had meticulously maintained for her entire adult life completely disintegrated. The fall from high society was absolute and brutally swift. Without access to a single penny of David's estate or the corporate accounts, Beverly had been physically escorted off the Virginia property by federal marshals. She was not permitted to pack her designer luggage or take her expensive jewelry collections. The agents allowed her to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single small bag of basic necessities. With her bank accounts completely frozen by the Department of Justice, Beverly had nowhere to go. The very same country club friends who had eagerly attended her lavish estate reclamation party just days prior suddenly treated her like a highly contagious disease. When Beverly tried to call them to ask for a temporary place to stay, her calls went straight to voicemail. When she showed up at the gates of the country club begging for entry, the security guards informed her that her membership had been suspended pending a federal investigation. The extended family members who had relentlessly harassed me with vicious text messages were now in a state of absolute blind panic. Aunt Linda, who had boldly called me a shameless gold digger, immediately blocked Beverly's phone number. She was terrified that the federal investigators would discover the generous corporate loans Beverly had illegally issued to her over the years. Cousin Brian and Uncle Thomas completely cut all ties, deleting every single message they had ever sent regarding the estate. They knew that the Department of Defense was auditing every transaction tied to the Defense Logistics Company. They were desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Beverly's greed. Beverly was forced to drain the last remaining dollars from a forgotten emergency cash stash just to secure a miserable, cramped motel room on the edge of town. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. It was a humiliating downgrade for a woman who had spent her entire life judging the working class. Jason was in an even worse state. He had spent 4 agonizing nights in a federal holding cell before a court-appointed public defender managed to secure his release on a restricted bond. Jason had no access to his luxury cars, no corporate credit cards to fund his extravagant dinners, and no tailored suits to hide his insecurities. He was forced to move into the dingy motel room with his mother. The golden child was spiraling out of control. Without his stolen money and manufactured power, Jason was nothing. He spent his days pacing the small, dirty motel room, wearing the same wrinkled sweatpants, unable to cope with the reality of his impending destruction. The tension between mother and son was highly volatile. Beverly could not forgive Jason for throwing her under the bus in the courtroom. Jason blamed Beverly for dragging him into the forged loan applications in the first place. But their bitter infighting was entirely overshadowed by the crushing weight of their legal situation. They sat across from their overworked public defender in a cramped, poorly lit government office. The attorney dropped a massive stack of federal discovery files onto his metal desk. He looked at Beverly and Jason with profound exhaustion. The public defender explained that their situation was legally indefensible. The Department of Defense investigators possessed flawless, irrefutable evidence. The government had the forged signatures, the offshore routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of every illegal transaction they had ever authorized. The attorney bluntly informed them that they were both facing decades in federal prison. The fraud charges were extensive, and the government was determined to make a highly visible example out of them for stealing military supply chain funds. Jason began to hyperventilate. He begged the public defender to negotiate a plea deal. He promised to cooperate, offering to testify against anyone the government wanted. The public defender shook his head with grim finality. He explained that the federal prosecutors did not need their cooperation. The government already possessed a perfectly clear, comprehensively mapped accounting of the entire criminal enterprise. They did not need Jason to testify because they already had a protected federal witness who had provided the complete shadow ledgers. "Who is the witness?" Beverly demanded, her voice cracking with desperate panic. The public defender pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the desk. He explained that the witness was a highly qualified forensic accountant who had been granted total, irrevocable federal immunity for coming forward and reporting the embezzlement prior to the corporate takeover. The witness had designed the forensic maps that the Department of Defense was currently using to prosecute them. Beverly and Jason stared at the name printed clearly on the federal document. It was my name. The reality of my strategy finally crashed down upon them. They realized that I had not just handed them the company to ruin them financially. I had built the exact legal framework that the federal government was now using to send them to prison. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. Jason grabbed the edge of the metal desk, his hands shaking violently. He asked the public defender if there was any possible way to reduce their sentences. He pleaded for a loophole, a legal technicality, anything that could save him from spending the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. The public defender let out a heavy sigh. He explained that there was only one highly unlikely avenue for sentence reduction. The federal prosecutors were relying heavily on the contextual accounting maps I had provided. Those maps grouped the stolen funds together under the broad umbrella of corporate fraud. However, if the forensic accountant who created those maps was willing to formally clarify the intent behind specific transactions, they might be able to separate Jason's reckless spending from Beverly's calculated forgery. If I was willing to hand over my raw, unedited working files to the defense team and testify that one party was significantly less culpable than the other, the judge might consider a reduced sentence for that specific individual. The attorney made it perfectly clear that this was an astronomical long shot. The federal witness owed them absolutely nothing. She had full immunity. She was entirely protected. She had zero legal obligation to assist the defense team in any capacity. The public defender told them that securing her cooperation would require a personal miracle. Beverly and Jason walked out of the public defender office and stood in the hot, cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The blazing afternoon sun beat down on them, offering no comfort. They were completely stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their social standing. They were staring down the barrel of a devastating federal prison sentence with no money to fight the charges and no friends to support them. They looked at each other in the harsh daylight. The bitter resentment between them momentarily dissolved, replaced by a shared, terrifying realization. They had spent years mocking my career. They had treated me like a worthless outsider who was completely beneath their elite social status. They had driven me out of my own home and cheered as I walked away with a single suitcase. They had spent the last 2 weeks spreading vicious lies about my character to anyone who would listen. Now out of options and facing years behind bars, they recognized that their entire future rested exclusively in my hands. I was the only person on Earth who held the detailed forensic accounting files that could potentially save them from maximum security prison. I held the absolute power of life and death over their freedom. Beverly swallowed hard, the realization tasting like ash in her mouth. Jason looked at the ground, his former arrogance completely hollowed out by fear. They knew exactly what they had to do. They were forced to do the one thing they swore they would never, ever do. They had to find the cheap rented apartment they had so mercilessly mocked me for moving into. They had to track down the little accountant they had so proudly discarded. And they had to beg for her mercy. The rain hammering against my apartment window was the only sound left after I closed the door on Beverly and Jason. I turned the heavy deadbolt, the solid metallic click sealing them outside in the cold storm where they belonged. I did not look back through the peephole. I did not care if they were still kneeling on the wet concrete or if they were dragging themselves back to their miserable motel room. Their desperate pleas for mercy had bounced right off me, failing to leave even a single scratch on my conscience. I took a slow sip of my coffee, relishing the rich, dark flavor. The cheap particle board desk in my living room suddenly felt like a throne. I sat down, opened my personal laptop, and prepared to look at the final masterfully hidden piece of the brilliant puzzle my husband had left behind. I navigated to a highly secure private banking portal. I typed in my credentials with steady, confident fingers. The screen refreshed, displaying a pristine, newly activated account. The balance glowing back at me in bold green numbers was exactly $5 million. It was not corporate revenue. It was not tied to any defense logistics contract. It was an absolute, untouchable fortress of clean cash. This was the ultimate safety net David had built for me, a financial shield designed to deploy the moment the rest of his empire burned to the ground. Months before his sudden heart attack, long before we even initiated the internal audit that uncovered his family's massive embezzlement, David had quietly taken action. He knew his mother and brother were parasites, and he suspected they were bleeding the company dry. While he prepared to investigate the corporate fraud, he also prepared for the absolute worst-case scenario. He had contacted a private broker and purchased a massive premium life insurance policy. He paid the premiums using funds from a completely separate, untainted personal account that Beverly and Jason had absolutely no knowledge of. The genius of David's final maneuver rested entirely in the legal structure of the policy. By naming me directly as the designated primary beneficiary, David ensured that the $5 million completely bypassed the probate courts. The money never entered the official estate that Beverly had fought so viciously to claim. It was entirely shielded from the sweeping asset freeze implemented by the Department of Justice. Because it was a direct life insurance payout, it was entirely clean, untaxable cash. David had essentially handed Beverly a ticking time bomb wrapped in a multi-million-dollar bow while secretly slipping me the keys to a brand new life. I sat in the quiet of my small apartment, looking at the glowing numbers on the screen. Tears finally pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of profound gratitude and overwhelming love. David had spent his final weeks making absolutely certain that the woman he loved would never have to rely on the mercy of a family that despised her. He had protected me from the grave. I closed the laptop, a deep sense of resolution settling into my bones. The Virginia estate was gone. The toxic family was destroyed. It was time for me to rise from the ashes and build a kingdom of my own. 6 months passed, and my life transformed with breathtaking speed. I packed up my single suitcase and left the dreary outskirts of Alexandria far behind. Armed with $5 million of undeniable financial security and a flawless reputation with federal investigators, I moved to Washington, District of Columbia. The nation's capital was the epicenter of power government contracting and high-stakes financial oversight. It was exactly where a woman with my specific set of skills belonged. I leased a stunning glass-walled office space on the top floor of a prestigious commercial building overlooking the city skyline. I did not just open a standard accounting firm. I leveraged the intense high-profile relationships I had forged during the collapse of David's company. The lead investigators from the Department of Defense had been incredibly impressed by the meticulous bulletproof forensic maps I had provided to take down Beverly and Jason. They personally vouched for my expertise to their colleagues in the intelligence and oversight communities. Word spread rapidly through the elite circles of the capital. I launched a specialized high-tier forensic accounting agency dedicated exclusively to tracking defense contract fraud and military supply chain embezzlement. My business boomed instantly. Massive defense contractors terrified of facing federal audits hired my firm to clean up their ledgers and identify internal theft. Government oversight committees contracted me as an independent consultant to trace missing tactical funds. I was no longer the little accountant that Beverly had sneered at during Thanksgiving dinners. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a highly sought-after financial intelligence firm. I hired a team of brilliant analysts handpicking young, hungry professionals who shared my relentless dedication to the truth. I wore custom-tailored suits that rivaled anything Beverly had ever purchased. I walked into high-security boardrooms filled with generals and politicians, and I commanded absolute respect. The success was exhilarating, a daily validation of the talent and intellect my late husband had always championed. I was building a legacy that required no apologies and relied on no one else's approval. My days were packed with high-level strategy meetings, complex financial deciphering, and the profound satisfaction of exposing corporate parasites who thought they could steal from the government and get away with it. I structured my new life with the exact discipline David had taught me. I purchased a beautiful modern townhouse in a secure neighborhood. I joined professional networks and built a circle of friends who valued loyalty and integrity above social status. The crushing grief of losing my husband slowly morphed into a quiet, enduring strength. I carried his memory with me into every boardroom and every successful negotiation, knowing he would be exceptionally proud of the woman I had become. The shadows of my former in-laws rarely crossed my mind anymore. Their absolute destruction was a closed chapter, a necessary cleansing that allowed my real life to begin. I read brief updates in the local business journals about their impending criminal trials, but I felt no desire to gloat or revel in their misery. Their punishment was entirely of their own making, and my focus was firmly fixed on my booming enterprise. I had elevated myself so far above their petty, fraudulent existence that they were nothing more than a distant, unpleasant memory. It was late on a Friday afternoon when the notification arrived. The bustling energy of my Washington office had quieted down as my staff headed home for the weekend. I was sitting at my sleek, modern desk reviewing a final audit report for a major aerospace client when a secure message chimed on my private computer monitor. The sender was my high-end real estate broker, a discreet professional I had retained a few months prior for a very specific mission. I opened the email, my eyes scanning the brief, highly anticipated text. The federal government had finally completed the monumental task of processing the seized assets from the defense logistics company, Collapse. After months of bureaucratic red tape and legal maneuvering, the Department of Justice was officially liquidating the physical properties to recoup the stolen funds. My broker had forwarded me the exclusive catalog for the upcoming federal foreclosure auction block. I scrolled through the digital listings of seized commercial warehouses and impounded luxury vehicles, completely uninterested in the company remnants. Then I saw it. There it was listed right at the top of the residential auction schedule. The sprawling Virginia estate, the grand multi-million-dollar home where Beverly had ambushed me at my husband's wake. The fortress where Jason had arrogantly jingled stolen car keys. The listing photos showed the property completely vacant. The grand foyer where Beverly had handed me the cease and desist letter was stripped of its pretentious antique furniture. The expansive dining room where she had demanded my public surrender was empty and echoing. The estate had been thoroughly purged of its former owners and their toxic legacy. Because it was a rapid federal liquidation sale designed to immediately recover embezzled government funds, the starting bid was priced at an absolute fraction of the actual market value. The auction was scheduled to take place at the federal courthouse the following Thursday morning. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the soft hum of the city traffic drifting through my panoramic windows. I picked up a heavy gold-plated pen from my desk organizer. I reached across the smooth glass surface of my desk and pulled my personal calendar toward me. I found the date of the upcoming federal auction. With a slow, deliberate motion, I drew a thick, dark circle around the day. A triumphant, brilliant smile crossed my face. They had forced me out of that house with nothing but a single suitcase, convinced I would never return. They had laughed at my modest clothing and mocked my profession. They had been spectacularly wrong. I was not just going to attend that auction, I was going to buy back my home with cash. 6 months flew by with the speed of a bullet. The federal government moves slowly until it suddenly does not. Jason crumbled under the pressure of federal confinement faster than anyone could have ever anticipated. The reality of a concrete cell stripped away every ounce of his manufactured bravado. Facing decades in a maximum security prison, the Golden Child panicked and took a plea deal. He signed a comprehensive, humiliating confession detailing his own crimes and eagerly agreed to testify against his mother to secure a reduced sentence of 5 years. I read the court transcripts from his sentencing hearing. The federal judge looked down at Jason with absolute disgust, noting that a man who would steal from the military and then immediately betray his own mother possessed no moral compass whatsoever. Jason wept openly as the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs. A pathetic end for a man who once thought he owned the world. Beverly suffered an even more agonizing fate. The woman who had once commanded country club ballrooms and terrorized anyone she deemed beneath her was now living in a cramped, state-funded studio apartment on the most undesirable side of town. She was awaiting her own criminal trial, completely stripped of her designer wardrobe, her authentic pearls, and her aristocratic arrogance. The apartment smelled of cheap bleach and old cooking grease, a constant suffocating reminder of her total ruin. Her former friends pretended they had never known her. Her extended family treated her name like a curse word, terrified that associating with her would trigger an audit of their own finances. She spent her days sitting alone in a cheap vinyl chair, staring at the peeling wallpaper. She was entirely abandoned by the social circle she had sacrificed her own son to impress. She had traded her family for an illusion of power, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, my life in Washington, District of Columbia, had become a masterpiece of my own design. My forensic accounting firm was expanding rapidly, securing high-level government contracts and earning a fierce, untouchable reputation in the capital. I was respected, wealthy, and completely independent. But even amidst the soaring success, I kept my eyes strictly on the final prize. The federal government was finally ready to liquidate the seized assets to recover the stolen Department of Defense funds. The sprawling Virginia estate, the very house David and I had made our home, was listed on the federal foreclosure auction block. Because the property was tainted by a high-profile fraud case and required an immediate massive cash purchase, traditional buyers were highly hesitant. The starting bid was set at an absolute fraction of its true market value. I did not attend the auction myself. I had no desire to sit in a crowded courthouse or draw unnecessary attention to my newly acquired wealth. Instead, I sent the one man who truly deserved to see this story through to its righteous conclusion. Mr. Caldwell walked into the federal courthouse that Thursday morning, representing an anonymous corporate holding company. The holding company was a blind trust I had established entirely with the clean, untaxable funds from David's private life insurance policy. Mr. Caldwell later told me the auction was brief and ruthlessly efficient. A few opportunistic real estate developers tried to lowball the property, hoping to flip the grand estate for a quick profit. But Mr. Caldwell, acting on my strict and unyielding instructions, crushed their bids with overwhelming immediate cash offers. He stood at the back of the auction room, his posture straight and proud. When the federal auctioneer slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, declaring the property officially sold to our trust, Mr. Caldwell felt a profound sense of justice wash over him. He had spent months agonizing over his role in handing the estate to Beverly, carrying the heavy guilt of a man who thought he had failed his late friend. Now, he was the exact instrument that officially brought David's home back to its rightful owner. He called me the moment the paperwork cleared. His voice was thick with raw emotion as he told me the house was finally mine again. I took a rare afternoon off from my firm and drove down to Virginia. The weather was crisp and clear, the autumn air biting but refreshing. I rolled my car windows down, letting the wind rush through the cabin as I navigated the familiar highway. I turned my car onto the quiet, tree-lined road leading to the property, my heart beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. I pulled up to the long, sweeping driveway of the estate. There were no expensive European sports cars crowding the entrance today. There were no catered waitstaff or wealthy socialites whispering malicious gossip in the grand foyer. There was only the quiet, enduring majesty of the home David and I had loved. The grand brick facade stood tall against the bright blue sky, looking exactly as it had on the day we first moved in. I parked my car and walked slowly up the stone steps. The federal seizure notices had been scraped off the heavy mahogany front doors, leaving only faint traces of adhesive behind. I reached deep into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against a cool, jagged piece of brass. It was the exact same house key I had detached from my ring on the day of David's wake. It was the very key I had dropped directly into Beverly's greedy, outstretched palm while she sneered at me in front of grieving military officers. When the federal marshals raided the property and seized Beverly's assets, that key had been cataloged, locked in an evidence box, and eventually transferred to the new legal owner of the estate, along with the property deed. It had found its way back to me, just as I always knew it would. I slid the brass key into the heavy metal deadbolt. The mechanism turned with a loud, incredibly satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped over the threshold. The grand foyer was empty, echoing slightly with the sound of my footsteps. The pretentious antique furniture Beverly had obsessed over was completely gone, auctioned off by the government to pay her massive legal debts. The space was stripped bare, flawlessly clean, and ready for a brand new beginning. I walked through the quiet rooms, running my hand along the polished wood of the grand stair railing. I moved into the formal dining room where Beverly had demanded my public surrender. Without her toxic presence filling the space, it was just a beautiful room, bathed in natural sunlight. The oppressive, suffocating energy that Beverly and Jason had brought into this house was completely eradicated. In its place was a profound, unshakable peace. I walked into David's former office, the room where Jason had taken his arrogant photograph. The desk was gone, but the spirit of the man who had worked there remained. I stood in the center of the room and looked out the large bay windows at the rolling Virginia landscape. I had not just survived their unimaginable cruelty, I had weaponized their own greed against them. I had protected my husband's true legacy from people who only wanted to exploit his name, avenged his betrayal with absolute precision, and reclaimed my life entirely on my own terms. David had given me the tools, the financial security, and the ultimate trust to execute his final orders. He knew I had the strength to endure the temporary humiliation for the sake of absolute, uncompromising justice. I took a deep breath, the clean, quiet air filling my lungs. I was no longer the little accountant they thought they could bully into submission. I was the architect of my own empire, a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged completely untouched. I turned away from the window, ready to fill these empty rooms with new memories, new success, and a life entirely of my own making. I walked back to the front door, stepped inside, and pushed the heavy mahogany shut, locking the past away forever. When we experience profound betrayal from those who are supposed to protect and love us, the natural human instinct is to fight back with everything we have. We want to scream our truth from the rooftops. We want to shake the people who misunderstood us and force them to see the reality of our pain. This instinct is entirely valid and deeply rooted in our innate need for justice and fairness. However, the most profound and universally applicable lesson we can extract from this harrowing journey is that true enduring power does not come from loud emotional retaliation. It comes from the absolute discipline of silent strategic detachment, combined with an unshakable knowledge of your own self-worth. The greatest victory you can ever achieve over a toxic family dynamic is not destroying your abusers in a screaming match, but quietly stepping out of their way so they can destroy themselves with their own unchecked greed and arrogance. Toxic individuals, especially those exhibiting deep narcissistic traits, thrive entirely on your emotional reaction. They view your tears, your anger, and your desperate attempts to defend your character as fuel for their dysfunction. When they launch a coordinated smear campaign or orchestrate a public humiliation, they are not just trying to cause you temporary emotional pain. They are trying to trap you in a defensive position. They want you to expend all your precious energy fighting a public relations war that they have already rigged against you from the start. If you stand in the center of the room and scream at your abusers, if you beg the bystanders to believe your side of the story, or if you fight tooth and nail for the superficial prizes they are trying to take from you, you play perfectly into their hands. You end up looking exactly like the unstable, grasping, or dramatic person they claim you are. By completely refusing to engage in their theatrical drama, you instantly starve them of the very reaction they need to validate their cruelty. This brings us to the core philosophy of strategic detachment, which is learning to recognize and abandon the empty fortress. Manipulative people are often completely obsessed with the optical illusions of power. They covet the grand houses, the luxury vehicles, the impressive corporate titles, and the superficial prestige of elite social circles. They genuinely believe that possessing these external material symbols makes them inherently superior to the people they abuse. But these things are very often just an empty fortress built on a fragile foundation of debt deception and the exploitation of others. The ultimate lesson is realizing that fighting over these physical or superficial assets is entirely pointless when the real value lies in the truth and the hidden liabilities attached to them. Learning to recognize the stark difference between a superficial prize and true lasting security is a revelation that can change the trajectory of your entire life. In our own lives, we frequently exhaust our physical and emotional reserves fighting toxic family members, abusive romantic partners, or manipulative coworkers for things that ultimately do not matter. We fight for a sincere apology that we will never actually receive. We fight for the approval and validation of people who are firmly committed to misunderstanding us. We fight for a seat at a family table where we are openly disrespected and minimized. The hardest but most necessary lesson is learning to stop fighting for the empty fortress. You must let them have the hollow victories. You must let them have the final word in a pointless argument. You must let them keep the shallow friends and relatives who are easily swayed by malicious gossip. When you willingly release your grip on the very things they use to control and threaten you, you instantly and permanently strip them of their power over your life. Of course, executing this level of strategic detachment requires an almost superhuman level of emotional discipline, especially when you are being publicly vilified by the people who should be protecting you. One of the absolute most painful aspects of surviving a toxic family system is having to stand by and watch the people around you willingly believe the lies. When extended family members flood your phone with vicious messages, accusing you of terrible things based entirely on the fabrications of your abuser, the temptation to furiously clear your name can be completely overwhelming. It is human nature to want to set the record straight and clear your conscience. We desperately believe that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, if we provide enough logical evidence, or if we show enough vulnerability, the enablers will suddenly wake up, see the truth, and offer a heartfelt apology. But the harsh, unavoidable reality of toxic dynamics is that the people who readily believe malicious gossip without ever pausing to ask for your side of the story are not your true allies. They are active, willing participants in the cycle of abuse. By choosing silence in the face of a smear campaign, you are not admitting guilt or showing weakness. You are establishing an impenetrable absolute boundary. You are making a highly conscious, empowering decision that your internal peace of mind is vastly more important than managing the opinions of people who are actively committed to your destruction. You are recognizing that anyone who requires you to defend your basic human decency is not someone who deserves a place in your future. The only possible way to maintain this profound silence is to possess a deep, unshakable knowledge of your own truth and to be meticulously, quietly prepared. You do not just walk away blindly and hope for the best. You walk away because you have already done the grueling, unglamorous work in the absolute shadows. In your own life, strategic detachment must always be paired with quiet, intelligent preparation. If you are dealing with a deeply toxic workplace, you do not throw a dramatic tantrum, flip your desk, and quit on the spot. You quietly and methodically update your professional resume, secure your strongest references, save your financial resources, and line up a significantly better opportunity before you ever hand in your formal resignation. Similarly, if you are attempting to escape a toxic relationship or a deeply manipulative family structure, you do not announce your departure and engage in a dramatic, exhausting standoff. You quietly gather your important legal documents, you independently secure your personal finances, you build an external support system of trusted friends or professionals, and you leave when they least expect it. True, formidable power always moves in total silence. It does not need to announce itself to the room. It does not need to beg for validation. It simply executes the plan and allows the resulting success to speak for itself. There is also a profound, almost cosmic justice in simply allowing toxic people to face the natural, unshielded consequences of their own actions. When you constantly intervene, when you fight them at every turn, or when you try to protect them from ruining themselves, you are actually interrupting the natural cycle of accountability. Abusers and manipulators are entirely responsible for their own eventual downfall. Their blinding greed, their unchecked arrogance, and their absolute certainty that they are completely above the rules or the law will inevitably drive them to seize a corrupted prize. You do not have to forge the documents, and you do not have to build the trap. You simply have to remove yourself as the emotional buffer between their reckless actions and the inevitable crushing consequences that follow. We often carry a tremendous, suffocating amount of guilt when we finally make the decision to walk away from abusive family members. Society has conditioned us to believe that we are perpetually responsible for the well-being of our blood relatives, and that setting firm boundaries is an act of unnatural betrayal. But removing yourself from the blast radius of someone else's toxic, destructive choices is not a betrayal of the family. It is an act of profound and necessary self-preservation. You are not required to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusers warm. Sometimes the most genuinely loving thing you can do for yourself, and the most universally just thing you can do for them, is to step completely aside and let the gravity of their own decisions pull them down to the earth. This lesson becomes even more critical when we examine the intersection of profound grief and familial betrayal. When a massive betrayal occurs simultaneously with a devastating personal loss, the psychological impact is uniquely destructive. In a healthy, functioning family, a period of profound grief would be a time of gathering together, of offering unconditional support, of sharing fond memories, and providing a safe, unquestioning harbor for the person who is suffering the most. The fact that toxic individuals will use a funeral or a medical emergency as an opportunity to launch a hostile takeover highlights the darkest, most predatory depths of narcissistic opportunism. It teaches us a brutal but absolutely necessary lesson about human nature. Toxic individuals do not pause their manipulation out of respect for your tragedy. In fact, they often view your moments of deepest, most debilitating vulnerability as their greatest and most lucrative opportunity to strike. They rely entirely on your emotional exhaustion. They bank on the fact that you will be too physically tired, too intellectually heartbroken, and too spiritually disoriented to fight back against their demands. Recognizing this predatory behavior is absolutely essential for your long-term survival. It forces us to understand that we cannot rely on the basic decency of people who have consistently, over the course of decades, proven that they possess none. When you are grieving, or when you are facing a massive, destabilizing life crisis, that is the exact moment you must tighten your boundaries to their absolute maximum capacity. You must become fiercely and unapologetically protective of your own energy, because the people who view your pain as leverage will not hesitate to bleed you entirely dry while claiming they are doing it out of love. You have to learn to trust your instincts over their sweet words, recognizing that a knife in the back hurts just as much, even if the person holding it is smiling at you. Furthermore, the dynamic between the designated scapegoat and the favored golden child offers another crucial layer to this lesson. This toxic dichotomy is a recurring poison in dysfunctional families. The golden child is shielded from all consequences, praised for non-existent or mediocre achievements, and kept entirely dependent on the unearned wealth or approval provided by the abusive parents. The profound lesson here is that being the golden child is actually a terrible curse, brilliantly disguised as a blessing. By constantly bailing the favored child out and endlessly enabling their worst habits, the toxic parents completely strip them of the ability to function as a competent, resilient, and independent adult. When the ultimate crisis finally arrives, the golden child will always shatter instantly because they possess zero internal fortitude. They have never been allowed to face a real hardship, so they have absolutely no psychological tools to survive one. Conversely, the family scapegoat, the one who is constantly criticized, perpetually marginalized, and forced to fight for every single scrap of basic stability, develops incredible, undeniable strength. If you have survived systemic emotional abuse, you have likely developed the sharp instincts, the meticulous discipline, and the quiet, enduring patience required to navigate absolute catastrophe. The hardship you endured at the hands of your toxic family is often the exact forge that tempers you into an unbreakable force. The very traits they relentlessly criticize you for, your fierce independence, your quiet nature, your refusal to conform to their chaotic and destructive norms, are actually your greatest and most valuable assets. When the ultimate crisis arrives and the facade crumbles, the golden child will always collapse under the weight of their own cultivated incompetence, while the scapegoat will rely on the immense strength they built in the shadows to walk through the fire completely untouched. This entire narrative also offers a profound meditation on the true definition of wealth and security. Abusers are often obsessed with the aesthetics of affluence. They value the custom clothing, the luxury vehicles, the sprawling properties, and the social prestige of elite connections. They spend their entire lives performing for an audience of equally shallow peers constantly terrified of losing their fragile status. But this type of wealth is incredibly fragile because it is built on a rotting foundation of debt, constant deception, and the relentless exploitation of others. It requires a constant, exhausting daily maintenance of a completely false image. True wealth is something entirely different and vastly more powerful. True wealth is financial and emotional independence that is completely clean and legally unassailable. It is the profound peace of mind that comes from knowing you do not owe your soul, your time, or your dignity to a creditor or a manipulative family member. It is the ability to walk away from a toxic multi-million-dollar empire because you possess the intellectual capital, the professional integrity, and the sheer willpower to build your own from scratch. When you base your self-worth entirely on your personal character, your acquired skills, and your capacity to love genuinely, you become completely immune to the threats of people who only value material possessions. You cannot be blackmailed, bullied, or controlled when you are entirely willing to walk away from the very things they use as leverage against you. The aftermath of such a profound separation is where the real lasting work of healing finally begins. When you finally cut the cord and walk away from the chaotic, draining noise of a toxic family, the sudden silence can be incredibly deafening. You might feel entirely alone in the world. You might question your own sanity and wonder if you misinterpreted the abuse. You might wonder if you made a terrible, irreversible mistake by leaving. This is the critical moment where you must redirect all the energy you previously spent defending yourself into the beautiful process of rebuilding yourself. You must not spend your newly acquired freedom on frivolous revenge or desperate, lingering attempts to prove your worth to the people who discarded you. You must channel your resources, your time, and your impeccable reputation into building an elite, fulfilling life. You must surround yourself with people who value integrity over status, people who love you for who you are rather than what you can provide for them. You must create a kingdom entirely of your own making, filled with peace, respect, and mutual support. The ultimate lesson is that surviving the abuse is only the first half of the journey. The second, and arguably much more important half, is giving yourself full, unapologetic permission to thrive in the aftermath. Success that is built on a solid foundation of authenticity and hard work is the absolute ultimate antidote to the poison of a toxic past. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that their cruel narrative about your supposed failures was a complete lie. It proves that you are entirely capable of writing your own beautiful story independent of the roles they tried to force you into. Ultimately, the story of choosing strategic silence and walking away teaches us that we have complete sovereign agency over how we respond to the cruelty of the world. We cannot control the actions of greedy, manipulative, or deeply broken people. We cannot force our parents to love us unconditionally, and we cannot force our siblings to treat us with basic human respect. We cannot dictate what malicious rumors are whispered about us behind closed doors by people who thrive on drama. But we retain absolute undeniable control over our own reactions. We get to decide whether we engage in the endless mudslinging or whether we rise completely above it. We get to decide whether we define ourselves by the intense pain they inflicted or by the incredible strength we forged in spite of it. True justice is not always delivered in a dramatic courtroom setting, and it almost never comes with a sincere public apology from your abusers. True justice is looking directly at the people who tried their hardest to break you, realizing with absolute clarity that they have zero power over your future, and walking away into a life of profound peace, prosperity, and deep self-respect. It is the quiet, satisfying knowledge that while they are permanently trapped in a prison of their own making, whether literal or psychological, you are completely, beautifully, and undeniably free. If you have ever found yourself constantly fighting for a place at a table where you are openly disrespected, or if you are currently exhausting yourself trying to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, it is time to stop. I want you to take a deep look at the relationships in your life that drain your energy and ask yourself if you are fighting for an empty fortress. I encourage you to step back, embrace the incredible power of your own silence, and redirect all of that precious energy into building a life that truly brings you peace. Please share your own stories of walking away from toxicity in the comments section below, because your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally find their own freedom. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join a community of people who are choosing healing, strength, and authentic success over manufactured family drama. Your true legacy is waiting for you to build it, so take that first step today and never look back.